Everybody remembers the gallows. Almost nobody notices that it started with pride. Haman was doing extremely well. He had status. He had access to the king. He had authority. He had people stepping aside when he walked through the palace gates. And most importantly to Haman, people bowed. Almost everyone, anyway. Because sitting near the king's gate was a man named Mordecai, and Mordecai did not bow. That was it. No dramatic speech, no public rebellion, no sword pulled from a cloak. He simply refused to bend. And somehow one man standing upright managed to ruin Haman's entire day. And this is where the simple version of the story begins to crack, because Haman's problem was not that nobody respected him. Plenty of people respected him. His problem was that one person didn't. It was like someone with a powerful position receiving applause from almost an entire room, then spending the rest of the evening staring at the one person who refused to clap. For a normal person, that might be irritating. For Haman, apparently it was a crisis. Every time he passed the gate, there was Mordecai. Still there. Still not bowing. Still somehow existing without confirming how important Haman believed himself to be. And Haman noticed. Of course he noticed. Pride has an impressive ability to ignore 100 people showing respect and immediately detect the one person who seems unimpressed. Haman could walk through the palace surrounded by honor, servants, officials, influence, and royal privilege. Then he would see Mordecai, and suddenly none of the rest seemed enough. That was the real problem. Haman did not simply enjoy being honored. He needed everyone to participate. Mordecai's refusal was not taking away Haman's position. He was not replacing him. He was not stealing his wealth. He was not convincing the king to remove him. He just would not bow. But to Haman, that small refusal felt enormous. Because Mordecai was challenging something Haman had quietly started believing, that his position meant everyone should confirm the greatness he had already invented for himself. One man standing became unbearable, because Haman needed the whole room to agree with his opinion of Haman. Apparently, 99 people bowing were not enough if number 100 stayed upright. And that tiny crack in his pride was about to become something much larger. Haman became angry. Then he learned that Mordecai was Jewish, and instead of deciding that one stubborn man was enough of a problem, Haman did what powerful offended men sometimes do. He made the problem much, much bigger. He would not simply punish Mordecai. He would go after Mordecai's people, all of them. No wood had been raised yet. No structure had been built. No final trap had been prepared. Haman thought he was still standing at the beginning of his victory. He was actually standing at the beginning of his fall, and the gallows still hadn't even been built. And that was the real warning. Haman did not begin losing when he planned Mordecai's death. The crack had started earlier, when being honored stopped feeling good and started feeling necessary. By this point, Haman had almost everything a powerful man could want. Position, influence, access to the king, public recognition, people bowing when he passed. But apparently power becomes strangely exhausting when it needs constant applause, because every time Mordecai refused to bow, Haman did not see one man making one decision. He saw an insult, and the insult kept growing. That is what made the situation dangerous. Haman could have ignored Mordecai. He could have walked through the gate, noticed him sitting there, and continued with the extremely difficult task of being one of the most powerful men in the empire. But he could not, because pride rarely introduces itself as pride. It usually arrives wearing something more respectable: honor, respect, order, authority. Haman could tell himself that Mordecai was disrespecting his position. He could tell himself that this was about proper behavior. He could even make his anger sound reasonable. But underneath all of that was a simpler problem. He needed Mordecai to bow. Not because Mordecai's bow would increase his power. It would not. Not because it would make him richer. It would not. Not because the king had suddenly forgotten who Haman was. He had not. Haman needed it because one person refusing to participate made his greatness feel incomplete. Apparently being powerful was not enough if someone nearby forgot to look impressed. So the more Mordecai stood, the more Haman's anger grew. And the strange part was that the balance of power was completely ridiculous. Haman had royal influence. Mordecai had a seat near the gate. Haman had people obeying him. Mordecai had knees that remained inconveniently straight, yet somehow Haman was the one losing peace. It was like having the entire room on your side and spending the evening furious because one person did not clap. That is what fragile pride does. It turns abundance into scarcity. 100 signs of respect become invisible because one person withheld his. And eventually, Haman stopped seeing Mordecai as a man. He started seeing him as a problem that had to be removed. That shift mattered. Because once pride decides that another person's existence is an offense, anger starts looking for permission to become action. And Haman had something most angry people do not have: power. Enough power to take a personal resentment and give it official clothing. Enough influence to make private hatred sound like public policy. So the story was no longer about a man refusing to bow. It was becoming about what another man was willing to destroy because of it. And that is when one wounded ego began turning a personal offense into an official plan. Then Haman decided that punishing Mordecai was not enough. And that is where the story changed. This was no longer irritation. It was no longer one powerful man feeling insulted because another man refused to bow. Now there was a plan, and the size of that plan revealed the size of the wound underneath it. Haman did not simply want Mordecai corrected. He wanted Mordecai removed completely. But even that was not enough. Once Haman learned that Mordecai was Jewish, he expanded his anger from one man to an entire people, which is an impressive escalation. One person refuses to bow and somehow the response becomes, perhaps everyone connected to him should disappear. Very reasonable. Haman had taken a personal humiliation and turned it into organized destruction. That is what made his pride dangerous. A wounded ego is unpleasant. A wounded ego with access to power can become policy. So Haman approached King Ahasuerus with a carefully packaged argument. He did not walk in and say, "There is one man at the gate who refuses to make me feel important, and I am taking it badly." That probably would have sounded less impressive. Instead, he described a scattered people with different laws and suggested that allowing them to remain was not in the king's interest. Suddenly, his resentment sounded administrative, official, almost responsible. Because apparently, hatred becomes much more respectable when someone puts royal language around it. Haman even offered money for the plan. The king gave him authority, and just like that, one man's bruised pride had entered the machinery of an empire. Orders were written. Messages were prepared. Couriers were sent. A date was established. What began at a palace gate was now traveling across provinces. That was the real scale of Haman's problem. He had enough status to ignore Mordecai. Instead, he used that status to magnify him. Mordecai had wounded his image, so Haman tried to use an entire system to crush the source of the embarrassment. It was like controlling the whole building and deciding to demolish it because one person refused to compliment the lobby. The cruelty did not come from some enormous noble cause. It came from something much smaller, an ego that could not tolerate resistance, and an ego that's small becomes terrifying when the hands holding it have too much power. Haman had transformed resentment into a project. There were decrees now, officials, dates, authority, consequences. He had taken an emotional reaction and given it infrastructure. Basically, Haman had turned wounded pride into project management. And he was not finished. Because even after creating a plan against an entire people, Mordecai was still there, still alive, still visible, still refusing to give Haman the one thing all that power had failed to produce: satisfaction. So Haman went home angry. And soon, with advice from the people around him, his resentment would become something physical, something tall, something built specifically for Mordecai. Haman believed he was preparing the solution to his problem. He was actually beginning construction on his own downfall. And then Haman's resentment became something you could actually build. He went home furious about Mordecai, which was impressive considering Haman had just attended a private banquet with the king and Queen Esther. He had wealth, status, influence, royal access, and yet one man sitting at a gate was still somehow winning the battle for space inside his head. So Haman gathered his wife, Zeresh, and his friends. He told them about his riches. his sons, his promotions, his special invitation from Esther. Basically, Haman gave everyone a detailed presentation called Reasons Haman is Doing Extremely Well. Then he reached the important part. None of it satisfied him as long as Mordecai was still sitting at the king's gate. There it was. Everything Haman had became worthless because one man would not bow, and his friends had a solution. Build a gallows for Mordecai, a very tall one. Then ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai killed on it. Haman liked the idea. Of course he did. The gallows were built, and this is where the plan stopped being just a threat and became complete irony, because Haman was so certain of his victory that he began constructing the ending before the story had finished. He could already picture it. Mordecai gone, the insult erased, the annoying man at the gate finally removed. Problem solved. Except Haman had missed one small detail. He did not control the story. That same night, the king could not sleep, so records were read to him. And buried inside those records was something Haman desperately did not need the king remembering at that exact moment. Mordecai had once uncovered a plot against the king, and he had never been rewarded. The next morning, Haman entered the palace ready to request Mordecai's death. Perfect timing. Just not for Haman. Before he could make his request, the king asked him a question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman immediately assumed the king was talking about him. Naturally, because if Haman had one consistent talent, it was making almost every situation about Haman. So he described an enormous public honor, royal robes, the king's horse, a parade through the city, public praise, excellent plan. The king agreed, then told Haman to do all of it for Mordecai. And just like that, the man who could not tolerate Mordecai refusing to honor him was ordered to publicly honor Mordecai. The gallows was still standing, waiting for the ending Haman had already imagined. But now the story had turned. Haman thought he had built the stage for Mordecai's destruction. Instead, he had built a monument to his own arrogance. He had hated, he had planned, he had constructed. And while Haman was preparing another man's ending, his own ending was moving directly toward the structure he had built. Haman had built the gallows for Mordecai, and now the story was about to reveal who they were really for. After being forced to publicly honor the man he hated, Haman returned home humiliated. His wife and advisors noticed something he had not. This was going badly, very badly. They warned him that if Mordecai was Jewish, Haman might not be able to overcome him. Not exactly the motivational speech Haman needed, but before he had much time to process that, servants arrived to take him to Esther's second banquet. The king was there. Esther was there. Haman was there. And Haman still had no idea that the entire structure of his power was beginning to collapse. At the banquet, the king asked Esther what she wanted. This time she answered. She revealed that she was Jewish. Then she explained that her people had been sentenced to destruction. The king wanted to know who had done this. Esther pointed to Haman. Suddenly, the man who had spent so much time controlling other people's fate had a very immediate problem with his own. The king was furious. Haman panicked. All the confidence disappeared. The position, the access, the authority. None of it could protect him now. And then came the final irony. One of the king's officials mentioned something Haman had built, the gallows. The same gallows prepared for Mordecai. The same Mordecai who had once saved the king. The structure was already there, finished waiting. Haman had spent his energy preparing the end of another man, and somehow had prepared the setting for his own. The king ordered that Haman be put on the gallows he had built for Mordecai. And Haman died on them. That is why the famous ending works so well. It was not random. It was not simply an unlucky reversal appearing from nowhere. Haman had been building toward it for a long time. First, he needed everyone to honor him. Then one man refused. Pride became anger. Anger became hatred. Hatred became a plan. The plan became official power. And eventually, that power became a physical structure standing outside his own house. Haman thought the gallows proved how completely he controlled Mordecai's future. Instead, they proved how little he controlled his own. He had position, access to the king, influence, recognition, people bowing. But Mordecai remained standing, and Haman could not tolerate it. That was enough to make him turn vanity into destruction. And eventually, the arrogance that convinced him he had already won became the thing that exposed how badly he had misread everything. Sometimes pride does not merely contribute to a person's downfall. Sometimes it builds it, piece by piece, decision by decision. Haman built a stage for what he imagined would be his victory. By the end, it displayed his ruin instead. He built the gallows for another man, but his own story ended on them. Which misunderstood Bible story should be simplified next? Saul, Absalom, or Pharaoh?